Thankfulness. When I was 5 years old, I climbed up to my grandfather's roof. On that, my grandfather had a 3-story house that he'd built himself, which was probably a really big deal back then. And I built this 3-story house, had a mono-pitch roof, which was just sloping one way. And at the end of the downward slope, there's a gutter, and then there is a 3-story fall onto the paved driveway below. My dad and my granddad were up fixing the roof one day, and I decided as a 5-year-old boy that I would get amongst it and climb on up there too. They must have left a ladder or something off one of the 2nd-story decks, I think, going up onto the roof. And so I remember climbing up and seeing just the look of shock and surprise on my grandfather and dad's face. You know, it's like, hey, I'm here. This is before like health and safety, you know, before we valued workers' lives. And so it's before high-vis and helmets. It's before edge protection and harnesses, you know, so there ain't nothing to save you up there. This is when people died unnecessarily off roofs. And so I'm up there, and my dad and my granddad are shocked, and so I've climbed up on the high side, so it's like a slide beneath me. And my dad's over the other side of the roof, my granddad's about halfway between here and there, and then I don't know, probably in the middle of saying, it's okay, I'm up here to help, I slipped. You know, or in the middle of saying, I'm going to be careful, I slipped. And it turns out the roof made a pretty good slide. And so here I am going head first down the slide, probably waving to Dad all the way over there. Granddad's halfway between. He's a granddad, so he's probably not going to be able to move that quick to save me, you know? Granddad problems. And so there I am, and he's there, and I just go past them both, and I go off the edge. And I go and head first off the edge, and then somebody reaches out and grabs my ankle as I'm dangling off the edge. Turns out granddads can move when they need to. And so got some super granddad strength, got over there with a Zimmer frame, you know, like, or whatever. No, wasn't that old. And so got over there and saved my life. And I don't know if you've ever had one of those moments where you've reflected back and thought, man, that could have gone one or two ways, and I'm thankful it went the way it did. You know, I don't know if you've ever thought about different circumstances in your life and thought, man, that's a little bit more than coincidence. Like, that was a little too close to call. It's like there was someone protecting me. And I've looked over my life and thought, man, a lot of times in my life, I've put that to the test. In near-death experiences, I remember falling asleep at 16 years old at the wheel at over 100 kilometers an hour. And there was a drop away, a cliff on one side, and there was a hill on the other side. And I woke up at, I don't remember falling asleep, obviously, but I do remember waking up. I remember waking up at going about 10 or 20 kilometers an hour, just drifting along the hill. Could have been down the cliff, could have been anywhere, could have hit another car, but there I was, just drifting along. And, you know, I've vowed in my life I'm going to stop putting God's protection to the test. And I don't understand why sometimes we have loved ones and different people in our life that it's as if God didn't protect when He could have. But I do understand that God loves people and loves to protect people. He's not less loving than us, He's more loving than us, and if we love to protect the things we love, then He certainly likes to protect the things He loves. And we are the thing He loves, and He loves to protect us. And I think as we keep getting made in His image, we become protectors of the things we love, and we become protectors of the things He loves. It's part of how He wants to transform and change us. But here's the thing, many of us can put a lot of attention into protecting things that don't matter that much, and can neglect protecting the things that matter most or are most precious. And most people that own a car probably have some sort of insurance on that car so that there is a protection if there's an accident to their asset. But many people probably haven't thought much about this. How do I protect my relationships? Aren't relationships the most precious thing in the world? Like, is there anything more valuable than the relationships? It's like, Lord, you can take anything, but let me keep my relationships. They are what matters most. I don't care about the riches. I don't care about the other things. I care about the people in my life. And as a follower of Jesus, you might not be one. That's okay. It's good to have you here. But as a follower of Jesus, my most important relationship in my life is my relationship with Jesus. That is the most precious relationship I have. Probably my next most precious relationship is my relationship with my wife. Then it's my relationship with my kids. Then it's my relationship with my mum. It's my relationship with the church is probably my next most precious relationship. And I wonder, how much thought have you given to protecting the most precious relationships in your life? Because as we're transformed into God's image, I think He wants us to protect the things we love the most. And not protect all the lesser things and neglect the greater thing, if that makes sense. The best way I can liken this idea of protecting our relationships is to the idea of rust. I'm sure everybody's seen rust before, but if you've got an old car, you've seen rust. And if you've got a boat trailer, you've definitely seen rust, okay? See, here's the thing. Steel is one of the strongest substances on earth. We build most big, great things out of steel. This building is held up by steel. We build 100-story high buildings with steel. We build great bridges over great expanses of water with steel. Steel it's strong. Steel has integrity. Steel can be relied on. Steel can be built on. And if it's well protected, it'll last forever. Even a thin piece of steel, if I gave it to you, it's very unlikely that any person in this room would be able to break it with their bare hands. You might be able to bend it a little, but to break it or to snap it would be a whole nother thing. You could get your car out, and even just a 3 or 4 mil piece of steel, if it's formed in the right way, probably even running over in the car wouldn't even make a dent. It might just make a scratch. That's how strong it is. But here's the thing, steel exposed to oxygen, which is a bit of a weakling, and exposed to moisture, which is no big deal, begins a process that we call rust, but is, in the science lab called oxidization. And if that process is left unchecked for long enough, it will eat every piece of that steel, so there is nothing left. No strength, no integrity, nothing to be relied upon, nothing to be built upon. A little old oxygen, a little bit of moisture can take down the strongest of substances in our world. And if you've ever owned a boat trailer, here's the thing. It's not the rust on the outside that you need to be wary of. It's the rust on the inside. A lot of boat trailers, you're like, this is so boring. This is January. It's like a science lesson. Can we keep things basic? We'll get there, okay? Just embrace the boredom for a moment. And boat trailers, I see people rolling their eyes. There can be box sections of steel, which means it's like sealed, but there will be holes in it to let the water drain in and out. And the steel might be coated in a galvanization to protect it from the oxygen and the moisture so that the rust process doesn't begin. But the thing you have to be wary of is not the rust on the outside, because you can hose that down easily, but when you put it into the water, what happens is salt water gets on the inside of the box sections of steel, and salt eats away at the zinc coating over steel that's protecting it from the rust process. And even though you might not see it, it can be rusting on the inside, because once the protective layer is gone, the rust process begins. And if you leave it unchecked for long enough, it might look like there's no rust on the outside until it's too late. And in a critical moment, when the pressure's on, that steel will break because it's being thinned from the inside out. Here's the thing. Relationships are exactly the same way. Normally, everything looks fine until it's almost too late. Normally, it's easy to make it look good on the outside and to hose off the outside and to protect the outside, but it's not the outside where the devil seems to get his way with our relationships. It's the inside. And what can happen if we're not careful, if we don't protect our relationships, a rust process will begin that will erode the strongest friendship, the strongest faith, the strongest marriage, the strongest parental-child relationship can be eroded through a rust process if we don't keep up our protective layer. And it should be no surprise to anyone. When we get some steel to protect it, we dip it in galv. It's a zinc coating, electroplated on, super boring stuff. And so and it protects it so the oxygen and the moisture can't get to it. In relationships, we need to galvanize our relationships to protect them. And the zinc coating we put on our relationships is thankfulness. Thankfulness will protect your relationships from relational rust. And I want you to hear this today, because what's going to happen this year is an enemy is going to come against what is most precious to your life and aim to get in there and begin a rust process that will cause the destruction of what matters most to you. See, you have a God who loves you and wants what's best for you, but you live in an environment that is not pro you, and you have an enemy that's at work against you. And make no mistake about it, the enemy does not want you to have long and satisfying relationships. He wants you to have short-term relationships that leave you empty and worse off at the end. The enemy doesn't want you to have joy, wants you to trick you that short-term pleasure will lead to happiness, only to leave you more unhappy and trapped in the beginning. The enemy wants to attack your long-term friendships that will provide strength and stability to your life. The enemy wants you to dishonor your parents and separate as a family. The enemy wants to tear apart your marriage. The enemy wants you to not be in church, and the enemy wants to ruin your faith. And he'll do it through causing a relational rust process, but thankfulness is our protection against what he wants to do. Are you following me? Thankfulness. This is a church. I have a Bible here. We're going to read something from it, okay? So that you're just not believing me. There's a thing happening here which I think describes the process to us and helps us see how we can counteract it. And so we're going to be in Romans chapter 1, and just a bit of backstory. This book is written by a guy named Paul. He was like a great church father, a great church leader. And what he did is he wrote this book. It's the most beautiful, logical explanation of why the message of Jesus was worthy of him giving his whole life to. He starts off this chapter in verse 16 saying, I'm not ashamed of the good news of Jesus, for it is the power at work saving humanity. And then the rest of the book goes on to explain the power of that message. And to start off his explanation, what he's trying to establish is why there's no human beings without excuse in knowing God, because he's revealed himself. And so we're going to pick up the argument there in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. I'm in the Message version because it has some fun with the language. It says, but the basic reality of God is plain enough. Open your eyes, and there it is. Look at the creation. It'll make proof of God's existence. By taking a long and thoughtful look at what God has created, people have always been able to see what their eyes as such can't see. You're able to see with your eyes, but see something deeper, something of eternal power, for instance, and the mystery of his divine being. So nobody has a good excuse. But here's what happened. People knew God perfectly well, but when they didn't treat him like God, refusing to worship him, a process began. Actually, in the original language, it says when people didn't treat him like God and give him thanks, the rest of this process began. And so because they wouldn't give him thanks, they began to trivialize themselves into silliness and confusion, so that there was neither sense nor direction left in their lives. They pretended to know it all, but were illiterate regarding life. They traded the glory of God, who holds the whole world in his hands, for cheap figurines you can buy at any roadside stand. So God said, in effect, if that's what you want, that's what you'll get. It wasn't long before they were living in a pig pen, smeared with filth, filthy inside and out. And all of this because they traded the true God for a fake God. And they worshiped the God they made instead of the God who made them. The God we bless, the God who blesses us, oh yes. Worse followed, refusing to know God. They soon didn't know how to be human either. Women didn't know how to be women, and men didn't know how to be men. Skip a few verses, and says since they didn't bother to acknowledge God, God quit bothering them and let them run loose, and the process of destruction continued in their lives. I don't know if you can see it here, but it says God revealed himself, but they wouldn't worship him or give him thanks for who he was. And because of that, they began a process in their lives that ultimately resulted in them being distant from God. Here's what I want to tell you. If we are not thankful, we will not protect our faith in God. If you want to die with a stronger faith than you have now, if you don't want, I'm sure all of us can think of someone, and it's sad in our lives, who had a strong faith only to abandon it later in their life, or for it to not grow from glory to glory, but to grow from weakness to weakness until it was such a faith that made no impact in their life or anyone's around them. That does not have to be the way. Your faith does not have to rust. This is a relational deal with God, and the way we protect our relationships is through thankfulness. And here's what happens if we do not. I want to show you this process. If we could put that up, Brooklyn, that'd be awesome. Thank you. The process is if we don't give thanks to God, this process begins to happen. And if you read this passage of Scripture in different versions, you will see how this process is described. And to help you understand how it works between us and God, I'm going to use a child as an example so you'll see it completely, because we're all just children of God, okay? So this is like a Sunday school lesson for a moment. Has anyone ever seen an ungrateful child? I know, they're real rare, hard to find. Even the best of children can have an ungrateful moment, so all of us probably have seen one. It's okay. They're a work in progress just like you. And so what happens is if a child, they can have the best parents and live such a blessed life, but if they take their eyes off all the things they already have for a moment and they get centered on the one thing that they don't have and their parents aren't letting them have in a moment, ungratefulness sets in, right? They stop being thankful and they're focused on what they don't have. And you know what happens in that moment for a child? They begin to be deceived because they stopped giving thanks. What's deceived? You believe a lie as if it's true and you have no idea that it's happening because you're deceived. And so they start saying, my parents don't even love me. They won't let me go out. They don't even want me to be happy. Right? They start, because they weren't being thankful, they start creating a deceived image of their parent. All because they weren't being thankful. You can see how this happens with us and God. And then once we've created a deceived image of our parents, what happens is we start being critical of them. See, you never want me to have fun. You never want me to be happy. You always do this. You know, it's always never and always. It's never soft language. It's always extreme. And then the child becomes critical of the parent because they've created a deceived view that they're holding out on them, not blessing them. And so then they begin to criticize their actions. If they stay critical for long enough, they become cynical. Here's the thing, if you stay critical for long enough, you become very selfish. Criticism is effectively, the world's not working for me, and if you stay in that way for long enough, because you've become selfish, but you're deceived in it, so you don't think you're selfish, you think it's their problem, but if you stay there for long enough, you think everybody else is selfish. Because it becomes how you see the world without even realizing it. And cynicism is effectively selfishness manifesting in the way you see the world. You assume everyone else is selfish. Oh, they're trying to do good, but it's really just because they want to look important. Oh, they're being generous, but it's just so people will look at them. Oh, they've got those big dreams, but that's just so they can say they're better than us. And you assume that even people doing good things are doing it from selfish motives, but it's only because selfishness is set in your heart that you think everyone else is like you. And that's what happened. You go, Curate, I know it's like super heavy stuff for January. I get it. Auckland anniversary weekend. Yay, we lost the cricket. So that's that. And if you stay cynical, it's inevitable that you become directionless in your life. Let me explain why. Because a cynical person is defined by what they're against, not what they're for. So they become a pinball in a pinball machine, bouncing up against everybody else's stuff, but never going anywhere because they're just finding something new to react to because they're not for anything. They're not trying to make the world a better place, they're just trying to tear down the people who are. They're judging the people who are in the arena. They're yelling out from the stands of what they should be doing, why they are not doing anything. And so they become directionless. Because humanity so craves for significance and meaning, we will create it wherever we are. So even if we're directionless in the pinball machine, we'll need to find a way to get a sense of worth anywhere. And so in that reaction, we'll begin to give worth to worthless things. And this is what normally happens. What God designed to be a blessing on a journey for a higher calling, we make the end goal. We make pleasure, we make stuff, we make illusions of success, we make whatever it is, recreation, things that were supposed to be enjoyed, but not the main thing. We make the main thing and give our worth to worthless things. The inevitable result is we're not living how God designed us to live, and so good fruit is not being produced, and so something in our soul feels like it's dying and feels distant from God. The good news is God's not distant from anyone. He's closer than you'd ever imagine. From even the worst of sinners, He is closer than you could ever imagine. But the reality is that something in our soul dies when this rust process begins. And while we're only one decision away from being restored into God's presence, because He's so full of grace and mercy and love and invitation and a welcome to you, The reality is once we go through this process, something has died inside of us and we need God to resurrect it. We can't resurrect it ourselves. And that's why he sent Jesus. But this can happen to Christians. This happens all of the time. People have a strong faith, but disappointment happens. God didn't do something they really thought God should do. A prayer doesn't get answered. A loved one dies. A child passes away. And what happens is these tragedies become ways where we focus on all the things God hasn't done rather than all the things he has done. And those become so big in our eyes, all the things he hasn't done. And all the things he has done and proven himself become so minute because we don't have thankfulness. And in that transaction, then a rust process begins. And maybe for a while we keep coming to church and faking it, and we look like we've got our galv coating on the outside, but there's a rust in our soul. And it's eating us away. And thankfulness is how we protect our faith with the Lord. Thankfulness is how we protect our relationship with God. It's not that it makes those tragedies okay. It's just that it recenters us back on the one who loves us. There's always things we don't understand. There's always that stuff. And I'm not trying to gloss over it or belittle it, but I am saying thankfulness will mean that even the worst tragedy won't rob you of your most important relationship. Thankfulness. Thankfulness, thankfulness. We shouldn't really be surprised that thankfulness is how we keep our relationship with God strong, because it's how our relationship with God begins. You know, like the whole idea of being saved, coming into relationship with God began because you recognized God did something for you and you thanked him for it. That was your expression of faith. That's how you entered in. It's not because of something you earned. It's because of recognizing he did something and being grateful. And I love how simple God is. It's like the way you came in is the way you should go on. How you began is how you should finish. If thankfulness is how you enter, thankfulness is how you grow. That's why I like worship at church. It's not like what we do for a few minutes so that you can get here for the preaching part. It's so you've got time to get in here, you know, get everyone warmed up. If you didn't have another moment this week where you were thankful to God, at least you had the few moments this morning that we created for you to express your thankfulness. And I don't know if you noticed this morning, the songs weren't, they were beautiful, but they weren't like super complicated. It's like, God, you saved me. God, I'm a sinner and you set me free. God, I've got forgiveness. I had a debt, but you paid it. And it's not some like complicated thing. It's just recentering us on how we came in. And as we continue to be thankful for how we came in, it keeps us strong for how we go on. Do you know that sometimes as Christians we can take being saved for granted? We can take the sacrifice of Jesus for granted, right? And that's why we have those few moments where just if there was nothing else in your week that will help keep your faith strong. It's why when people distance themselves from those times or reserve their worship, it's a rust process beginning. All right, we got that one. Quickly, this one, I know not everybody here's married, but there's a lot of married people here, and there's a whole bunch of people that really like to be married here. And there's some people that you have a marriage story that you would rather rewrite, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your grace as we just talk about marriage, even though it might hurt for a moment. Thankfulness will protect your marriage. I'm not talking about, just as a disclaimer, I'm not talking about like, I'm not talking about an abusive relationship or a very dysfunctional relationship. In fact, thankfulness can be like really destructive in a really abusive relationship because you keep looking for glimmers to stay in something that maybe God doesn't want you to stay in. And so if you are in one of those relationships, we've got an amazing pastoral team here. We want to help you. So I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about marriages that maybe have grown tired, grown stale. Maybe you are on the edge of divorce. Maybe you're just grown apart. Thankfulness will turn around your marriage. Thankfulness will protect a marriage, it will turn around a marriage. Research has gone to show that if they can measure the gratitude level in someone towards their partner and them towards the other partner, they can predict the likelihood that they'll still be together in another year's time. And the more grateful they are, the more likely they will be together in another year's time. This is research. This is like the same process that happens between us and God happens in marriage. If you stop being thankful, you start being deceived. You start thinking, well, they don't love me, they don't whatever. You start being critical critical of everything they do. Even when they do good things, you're so cynical. You think they only do it to make themselves look better than you. And then you start giving worth to worthless things. You become directionless. You no longer have a vision for your marriage, and you grow distant. I made it sound so simple. It happens over years. But it's what happens. But thankfulness will turn it around. Let me show you how to turn it around. When you feel more grateful, research has shown what happens is you want to hold on to your relationship. When you feel more grateful, you obviously want to work to keep the relationship that now you want to hold on to. Yes, you can take a photo of it. Then, once you're working to keep your relationship, your partner begins to feel more appreciated. Because your partner feels more appreciated, your partner starts being more grateful. So now your partner wants to hold on to the relationship. And your partner wants to work to keep the relationship. And as they're working to keep the relationship, you start feeling more appreciated. And as you start feeling more appreciated, you start being grateful. And as you start being grateful, you all of a sudden want to hold on to the relationship. And then you want to work for the relationship. And then they start feeling appreciated. We could do this all day until you get it. If it doesn't take two, it takes one person to start the process and start a new cycle. Give me a little tip. I'll give you a little tip. It's not about being thankful that they did something. It's about being thankful for who they are. It's remembering why you chose them in the first place. Remember when the sun shone out of their, you had the rose-tinted glasses, they couldn't do anything wrong. But then you lived together for a year and they left the door open and all the mystery was gone. And familiarity, right, meant that all of a sudden it was easier to see the bad things than the good things. But thankfulness brings the good things back into focus. That's the power of it. That's the power of it. It just takes one person to start the process. Last example, the one everyone gets real quiet for because it's very convicting, our relationship with the church. Just in case you haven't realized, people who not change church, there's nothing wrong with changing church, just change well, leave somewhere well, start somewhere well. Just don't change too often, otherwise you'll never develop roots and actually mature and grow. But if the devil can't destroy your relationship with God, he'll just destroy your relationship with the church, so your relationship with God becomes of zero impact to another generation. There's so many people who grew up in church, then had kids, then got distant from the church, so their kids didn't grow up in church, and the legacy got ruined, and the devil he got around the side door and just robbed the impact of what a faith could have had. He robbed a calling. Nobody lives their full calling in the Lord disconnected from a church. Nobody's potential in Jesus ever gets fully flourishing disconnected from the church, because so much of what God has for your formation happens by doing life with people. Here's the thing. This church, if you haven't realized it or not, will inevitably hurt you if it hasn't already. But like any relationship, you start off, you see all the good things, but then familiarity means you see all the things you don't like. And if you're not intentional, it gets out of focus and gets out of whack. And so it's inevitable you'll get hurt here because it's not perfect. And it's not perfect because you're here. You are the problem. You are the problem. Because this is not a brand. This is not a place. This is not an organization. It's not any of those things. It's a community of people on a journey together. And so it is only the collection of relationships that exist. And because we're all imperfect, we're not very good at relationships. We're just on a journey together. So we're all going to hurt each other all the time. But here's the thing. When hurt and disappointment sets in, which is inevitable if you haven't figured it out already, whether or not you choose thankfulness for all the things that are good or not will determine whether or not a rust will happen towards you and the church. Just as a little tip, because I want to say this for Curate, because I really don't like it. I just don't want us to say this anymore. The church hurt me. Because no church ever hurt you. People who make up the church hurt you. And every time you say, the church hurt me, you blame like 1 billion people for something 3 people did. And we're probably all worthy of the blame. But here's what actually happens when you blame everybody. You abdicate your responsibility to reconcile. Because if you say the church, you're like, well, who would I talk to anyway to fix this? But the Bible's very clear. If you've got an offense, it's your job to go to somebody, not their job to come to you. It's the person who is offended and is hurt's job to, and I'm not trying to gloss over some of the horrible things that have been done in churches. But I'm trying to say the Bible is clear. You go and reconcile. Don't blame the whole church. Blame the person and go your best, try and fix it, and then move on, because it's only your soul that's rotting because of it. So can we just make a commitment? We're going to be like church blamers, because then if we're not church blamers, we can fix things and we can make things better. But this is what happens, right? Like it's like the church, we stop being thankful for the church that we're in, and then all of a sudden all we do is we begin being deceived. So we start making up well, they don't care about this, or they don't care about that. We get a deceived perspective of the church. And if then we start being critical of all the things that it is doing or not doing, and then we start being cynical. And I'll just give you the list of cynical things people say to me on a given week, like they're just trying to build an empire, they're just all about money, or just it's all about this or it's all about that. Because they've become selfish, they assume everyone else here is selfish, but I know the people here pretty well. I'd like to say that we're not. They go above and beyond to serve you every single week, and then we become directionless, we give worth to worthless things, and something in our soul becomes distant from God. If you want to have a strong faith to the day you die, it's going to require a strong relationship with God's church in some form or another till the day you die.